Hola from Panama. Today we're going to talk about communication. Even though communication is something we do every day and basically take for granted, it's really pretty phenomenal how it works. The idea that I can say something and you understand my thoughts and ideas is remarkable. It means there must be something that we share. But what exactly is it? The short answer, of course, is that we share language, but language is incredibly complex. So let's take a look at how it works and when it doesn't. Language is more than just words and grammar. It's actually a set of components or building blocks and conventions or culturally informed approaches, ways of interacting that allow us to build and share complex ideas. The components of language, or the building blocks, include the pronunciation and sound patterns, the words, phrases, and idioms, and the grammar. Each of these components has choices. We have a range of pitch, tone, and emphasis patterns. We have choices in vocabulary, synonyms, and even new words that we add. And we have different grammatical choices, including direct and indirect structures. In addition to the verbal components of language, we have nonverbal components as well. Things like eye contact, posture, gestures, personal space, and even silence. The conventions, or the approaches, take into account the people interacting and their relationship, as well as the purpose and the goals. For example, a convention might be turn-taking. That space between when one person talks and the other one talks carries meaning. And that meaning often depends on the setting and the interactant. Maybe with your friends, the gap between turns is really short. In other words, you basically just latch on to what the other person is saying to take your turn. But perhaps in a job interview, you wait until you're asked a question before you speak and give your answer. On their own, each of these components carries meaning. And then we put them together using our culture's conventions in order to create dialogue, instructions, lectures, proclamations, and so much more. For example, we might use direct grammar and short words for urgent instructions, like watch out, don't slip, and indirect grammar and longer words to give advice to a supervisor, for example, like it might be worth considering. And as complex individuals in complex societies, we rely on this range of choices to convey complex ideas. Of course, we rely on the other person to have the same shared set of meanings for each of these components in order for our message, our intention, to be communicated, to be successful. As language users, we acquire these building blocks and approaches both on their own and together through socialization. For example, we learn the difference between a smart man and a wise guy. In other words, we learn what kind of pronunciation signals sarcasm, and we learn that sarcasm signals that what we mean is the opposite of what we say. We also know that together, wise guy means something different than wise and guy. So communication works like this. I pick the tone, words, and grammar. I consider the setting, the participants, and the purpose, and tons of other small factors to put forward not just an idea, but an entire message that considers the relationship, the dynamics, previous conversations, and the resulting action I want taken. And if you share the same meaning for all of those components, then our communication works. Sounds pretty easy, right? Of course it isn't. Even when we have a lot in common, we misunderstand each other. Our diversity of experiences, our personalities, our subcultures, and tons of other factors lead to differences in interpretations and expectations. The problem is further intensified because language, like culture, is taught to us so early on and so deeply ingrained in us that we often don't realize that we may have different interpretations for the components and the conventions than other people. We think the way we communicate something is the way it will be understood. We think the way we understand something is the way it was meant. In other words, we think meaning is universal. So as an interculturalist, my goal is to help you think about how our subconscious understanding and usage of these elements gets in the way of effective and appropriate communication across cultures. In other words, to bring the subconscious up to the level of consciousness. One way to do this is to understand our own and others' cultural scripts. Cultural scripts is just another way of saying the expected ways of interacting with others in a variety of settings according to one's cultural norms. For example, in the US, a cultural script might look like this in a store. Upon entering the store clerk should greet the customer and ask if they need any help finding anything. The clerk and the customer are expected to have a friendly but superficial interaction, talking about benign things like the weather or the purpose of the shopping trip. And the clerk should thank the customer when leaving. In a business meeting, individuals should arrive early, greet each other with a handshake or a smile, and some superficial small talk. And then the most senior person should call the meeting to order, and the meeting should start on time. We carry with us hundreds of cultural scripts like this, expectations for interactions and interpretations for what each of the subtle components of language mean. For example, lack of greeting from a store clerk may make a customer hesitant to ask for help because the store clerk seems unfriendly. Tardiness to a meeting indicates lack of respect or even lack of responsibility, because being on time shows respect. If we can slow down and dissect the communication event into its components, we can learn more about the differences and what they mean according to the other person's cultural script. What's important to understand is that communication doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's an interaction between two people, and there are always at least two things going on in every interaction. First, there's content being conveyed, a topic, information, etc. Second, there is a relationship between the individuals being signaled, reinforced, negotiated. So some miscommunications are due to not understanding the content or the topic, but a lot of misunderstandings are due to different ways that the interactants felt their relationship was being negotiated or signaled. Because our sense of meaning lies below the level of awareness, we often just have an instinctive reaction, a gut reaction, blaming the other person for being rude. We don't really think about how the components and the conventions added up in our minds to create the meaning that we drew. Because in reality, there is no one simple way to be polite, even in a single culture. Politeness really just means appropriateness. And what is appropriate between two people in one given scenario isn't necessarily the same in another scenario, or with two different people. And then you layer on cultural differences, and there's really tons of ways that misunderstandings can arise. So let's take some time to look at what it means to be polite or appropriate, given different scenarios and different people. At a grocery store, if there's a product on the top shelf that I can't reach, I might say to a nearby tall customer, "Excuse me, would you mind grabbing that salt for me off that shelf? Thank you so much." At the dinner table, I might say to a family member, "Could you pass the salt, please?" The second scenario is much more direct and informal. In fact, if we use those same formal structures, like "would you mind," and lots of politeness markers, like "thank you so much," it would actually feel rude. It would feel distant or cold. It wouldn't work between those interactants in that setting. But we still phrase it as a question and use "please." But in Spain, for example, at the dinner table, they don't even use a question form or "please." As you'll see in this clip here, to ask for something, they would just say,
Primica, pásame una servilleta, ¿no? Gracias.
For an American, this might feel rude because this direct imperative might be taken as an order. Without a question or a politeness marker like "please," it feels really direct. But for a Spanish person, using that question form and a politeness marker actually feels distant and cold. So you can sort of see the continuum here. In fact, one of my friends told me she finally felt accepted by her Spanish in-laws when they stopped using "please" with her.
It's important to recognize that even though these differences convey things like formality or distance, informality, friendliness, they're both polite just different.
So when you feel frustrated, irritated, or confused after an interaction, consider that you may have different meanings associated with the components and the conventions than the other person does. You may have different cultural scripts. Take time to slow down and dig deeper into your meanings and be open to learning about others. And if you're doing all of this in a second language, I applaud you. This is hard work. I've been there and it's not easy. It's exhausting to put so much mental energy into listening and conversing and learning. It's stressful and disheartening at times. You may think that because you're not fluent, people see you as less competent, less intelligent, less funny. You just don't feel like yourself. But don't lose heart. Keep engaging, keep trying, be open to making mistakes and learning from them. I hope this video has given you a better understanding of how communication works and the ways miscommunications can happen. As you learn more about the ways meanings are intended and interpreted, I hope this helps you grow and develop the skills you need to be an appropriate and effective communicator in a variety of intercultural settings.